In 1900, while the world celebrated a new century of progress, Greek sponge divers pulled something impossible from the depths of the Mediterranean: corroded bronze gears, differential mechanisms, astronomical calculations etched in metal that predated Swiss clockwork by 1400 years, and against all odds of salt water and time, it survived. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on 5 impossible artifacts that should not exist. A 2,000-year-old computer found in a Roman shipwreck, its bronze wheels calculating the cosmos with precision we thought belonged only to the Renaissance. Clay jars from ancient Mesopotamia generating electricity before Benjamin Franklin was born. A Renaissance map showing Antarctic coastlines that have been buried under 2 miles of ice for 6,000 years. A temple complex in Turkey built by hunter-gatherers who weren't supposed to know how to move 20-ton stones 11,000 years before the pyramids. And buried in ice cores, in geological strata, in the shocked quartz of impact craters, evidence of a global cataclysm 12,000 years ago that reset everything. These are not theories. These are gears you can measure, batteries you can replicate, maps that match satellite surveys, and stones that still stand in circles pointing to stars. And what they whisper is terrifying. We are not humanity's first attempt at civilization. We are the reboot. What you are about to hear will fundamentally shatter the myth of linear progress and force you to ask a question that should keep you awake at night. How many times have we done this before? And are we racing toward another reset? Before we descend into the evidence that archaeology has tried to ignore, ignite that like button and prepare for revelations that will rewrite everything you thought you knew. Tell me in the comments, do you believe we're the first? Or are we just the latest chapter in humanity's book of forgetting? And as always with our videos, the visuals of crumbling temples and storm-torn pyramids are here to add atmosphere, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So whether you're watching closely or just listening in, settle in and let the comfortable lie of progress fade for a while. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. We begin our journey into the forgotten past, not in a museum or a library, but beneath 43 meters of Mediterranean seawater, off the rocky coast of Antikythera Island in Greece. To understand the magnitude of what we are about to discuss, you first have to understand the arrogance of the modern mind. In the conventional story of human civilization, there is a strict rule: progress is linear. We evolved from stone tools to bronze, from bronze to iron, from iron to steel, from steam engines to microchips. Each generation builds on the last. Knowledge only accumulates. We only move forward. This is the ladder of progress. It is comforting, logical, and universal. Except, there are artifacts buried in the archaeological record where this rule does not apply. There are technological anomalies where the ladder has rungs missing, or rungs that appear thousands of years too early. In the spring of 1900, the industrial world was drunk on the promise of the new century. Electric lights were illuminating cities. The Wright brothers were sketching flying machines. The future seemed inevitable, but in the Aegean Sea, off the coast of a small Greek island, a team of sponge divers was about to discover proof that the future had already happened and been forgotten. These weren't archaeologists. They were working men. Captain Dimitrios Kondos and his crew were diving for natural sponges to sell in the markets of Athens. They were hunting for profit, not history. The seabed off Antikythera was known to be treacherous, rocky, deep, and prone to sudden currents that could trap a diver in his heavy canvas suit and lead boots. On one particular dive, Elias Stadiatis descended into the blue-black depths. He was working at nearly 43 meters down, where the pressure crushes your chest, and every breath of compressed air tastes of copper and salt. And there, scattered across the seafloor like the bones of a drowned world, he found it. Bronze statues, marble sculptures, amphorae still sealed with wax. And among the debris, corroded lumps of bronze fused together by 2,000 years of salt and time. At the time, nobody could possibly comprehend what they had just discovered. The statues were hauled up and sent to museums. The bronze lumps dismissed as ship fittings, ballast, or scrap metal were boxed and stored in the basement of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. They sat there for 2 years, just another pile of corroded junk from another Roman shipwreck. But in 1902, a curious archaeologist named Valerios Stais decided to actually look at the corroded lumps. And when he carefully cleaned away a layer of encrustation, he saw something that should not exist. A gear. A bronze gear wheel, with teeth so precisely cut they could still mesh with neighbouring wheels. And this was only the beginning. Because what lay hidden inside that corroded bronze mass was not a simple wheel. It was a machine. A computer. An analog calculator built in 100 BC that wouldn't be matched in complexity for another 1400 years. If the ancient Greeks could build this, the question becomes unbearable. What else did they build? What else did we lose? And most terrifying of all, what if this wasn't the first time? For decades, after Stais first noticed that bronze gear, the Antikythera mechanism, sat in museum storage like a riddle wrapped in corrosion, archaeologists could see there were gears. Yes, but the mass was so fused together, so encrusted with 2 millennia of calcium carbonate and marine growth, that no one could understand what they were looking at. It was clearly mechanical. It was clearly ancient. But the ancients didn't build machines like this. Everyone knew that. The Greeks and Romans had simple gears for mills and siege engines, crude devices for moving weight or grinding grain. They didn't have precision instruments. They didn't have computers. Except they did. In 1971, a British physicist named Derek de Solla Price convinced the Greek government to let him X-ray the mechanism. What the imaging revealed was staggering. Inside the corroded bronze shell were at least 30 interlocking gears, some with teeth so fine they could only have been cut by a master craftsman using precision tools. The gears weren't random. They were organized into a system, a machine. Price spent years reconstructing the internal architecture from those blurry X-rays, and what emerged was something that shouldn't exist in 100 BC. It was an analog calculator, a mechanical device designed to compute the positions of the sun, moon, and planets across the zodiac. It could predict eclipses. It tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. It even accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon using a mechanical technique called epicyclic gearing, a mathematical concept that wasn't supposed to be understood until Islamic astronomers reinvented it in the medieval period. But Price's X-rays were primitive. The real horror came in 2006, when researchers used modern CT scanning technology, the same machines that image your bones in hospitals, to peer deeper into the mechanism. What they found made the archaeological community go silent. Differential gears. These are complex mechanical components that allow 2 inputs to drive a single output at varying speeds. You know where we use differential gears today? In the transmission of your car. The ancient Greeks had built a device with engineering sophistication that wouldn't reappear in human civilization until the 14th century, when European clockmakers began constructing the first mechanical astronomical clocks. Think about that timeline, between 100 BC and 1400 AD. That's 1400 years where this knowledge simply vanished. No one built anything remotely similar. No Roman engineer, no Byzantine craftsman, no Islamic inventor created a device with this level of mechanical complexity. It's as if someone handed the ancient Greeks a smartphone. They used it for a while, and then it disappeared for over a millennium before humanity figured out how to build phones again. The function of the mechanism tells us the Greeks didn't just have theoretical knowledge of astronomy, they had applied engineering. They were manufacturing precision instruments to calculate celestial mechanics. This wasn't philosophy, this was technology. And here's what should terrify you. We have no idea how common these devices were. Not a single ancient text describes the Antikythera mechanism or anything like it. Cicero mentions some kind of sphere built by Archimedes that showed planetary motion, but he gives no details. Imagine if all our computers were destroyed tomorrow and the only reference future archaeologists found was someone casually mentioning, "I used a device to check the weather." They'd have no idea what a computer actually was. So we're left with 2 equally disturbing possibilities. Either these mechanisms were so common in the ancient world that no one bothered writing about them, the way we don't write technical manuals about calculators, or they were already rare relics by 100 BC, fragments of an even older technological tradition that was fading from memory. Both options shatter the story we've been told. Both options mean the ladder of progress isn't a ladder at all. It's a spiral staircase. And we've been here before. If they could build this, what else have we lost? While the world was sliding toward another war, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was digging through the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. The year was 1936. König was the assistant director of the National Museum of Iraq, excavating a site near Baghdad that dated to the Parthian Empire, roughly 250 BC. What he found in the dirt shouldn't have made sense to him, but somehow it did. Clay jars, unremarkable at first glance, about the size of a man's fist. But inside, each jar was something peculiar. A copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod. The top was sealed with asphalt. The whole assembly was corroded, ancient, and completely inexplicable. König had studied enough about modern technology to recognize what he was looking at, even though it was impossible. He was looking at a battery, a galvanic cell, the kind of electrochemical device that wouldn't be invented, according to every history book, until Alessandro Volta created the first battery in 1800 AD. But here it was, buried in Mesopotamian soil, 2,000 years too early. The construction was simple but brilliant. The copper cylinder acts as the cathode. The iron rod is the anode. Fill the jar with an acidic electrolyte, grape juice or vinegar, both of which were common in the ancient world. And the chemical reaction between the dissimilar metals produces an electrical current. When researchers, in the 1940 seconds, built exact replicas using the same materials and methods, they measured the output, 1.1 to 2 volts. Not enough to power a light bulb, but enough to create a tangible shock, enough to do work. The Baghdad Battery didn't fit any known category of ancient artifact. Archaeologists scrambled for alternative explanations. Maybe it was a container for storing scrolls, but the shape was all wrong, too narrow and sealed. Maybe it was decorative, but it was too crude, too utilitarian. In 2005, the Mythbusters television show built their own version and connected 10 of them in series. The result? Enough voltage to electroplate a small metal object with a thin layer of silver. Suddenly, the golden and silver-plated artifacts found throughout ancient Mesopotamia looked different. Had they been using electricity for metallurgy? Ancient medical texts from the region describe using electric fish, specifically torpedo rays, to treat pain and headaches. Patients would stand in water while the fish shocked them. It was primitive electrotherapy. Some researchers believe the batteries might have been used for the same purpose, or perhaps to animate statues in temples. Imagine the psychological effect. You approach the idol of a god, reach out to touch it, and feel a tingling shock run through your fingers. The god is alive. But here's what should disturb you. Like the Antikythera mechanism, this technology exists in complete isolation. There's no evolutionary development, no series of prototypes showing them figuring it out, no earlier crude versions, no later refined versions, just the jar, the cylinder, the rod, perfectly functional and utterly unexplained. And like the mechanism, not a single contemporary text describes it. The Parthians left plenty of records, but none mention electricity, batteries, or anything resembling electrochemical science. This is the pattern of a remnant, not an invention. When you're inventing something, you iterate, you experiment, you leave behind failures and prototypes. But when you're preserving something, when you're holding on to a fragment of knowledge you inherited but no longer fully understand, you make exact copies. You follow the ritual without knowing why it works, so the question becomes unbearable. Were the ancient Mesopotamians discovering electricity through trial and error? Or were they remembering it? Were they the inventors? Or the curators of something even older? And if they could harness electrochemical reactions in 250 BC, what else did they power? What else have we forgotten how to see? In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis was assembling a world map in Constantinople. He was a respected naval commander and cartographer, and his map was intended to be a gift for the Sultan. But Piri Reis didn't claim to be drawing new coastlines. In his own handwritten notes on the map, he explicitly states that he compiled it from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and others even older. He mentions charts captured from Spanish sailors, maps from the Library of Alexandria, and ancient portolans that showed lands no living sailor had ever seen. When scholars finally examined the Piri Reis map in detail, what they found was disturbing. The South American coastline was rendered with stunning accuracy. The curve of Brazil, the mouth of the Amazon, details that shouldn't have been known in 1513. Columbus had only reached the Americas 21 years earlier, and the interior was still largely unmapped. But there was something far more impossible on this map. At the bottom edge, where the parchment trails off into blank space, there's a coastline. It shows mountains, river outlets, and bays, and it matches, almost perfectly, the coastline of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we see today, buried under miles of ice. The Antarctica that exists underneath. The land. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. And the subglacial coastline, the actual shape of the rock beneath the ice, wasn't mapped until 1949 when scientists used seismic sounding equipment to penetrate the ice sheet. Yet there it is on Piri Reis's map, drawn in 1513. How? In the 1,960 seconds, a historian named Charles Hapgood conducted a detailed analysis of the map's mathematical properties. What he discovered should have rewritten history. The map uses spherical trigonometry to project the curvature of the Earth onto a flat surface. This is advanced cartography. It also accurately calculates longitude, the east-west position of locations, something European navigators wouldn't reliably figure out until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. The map was sophisticated, far more sophisticated than it should have been. The academic response was predictable. Skeptics dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns that aren't there. They argued that the coastal features were random lines that coincidentally resembled Antarctica. But when modern researchers compared the Piri Reis map to satellite surveys of the subglacial continent, the correspondence was too precise. Specific bays aligned. River outlets matched. This wasn't random. This was cartography. Geological evidence tells us that Antarctica's coastline was last ice-free approximately 6,000 years ago, around 4,000 BC. Some estimates push that date even earlier, to the end of the last ice age. If the source maps Piri Reis used were based on first-hand observation, then someone was sailing the Antarctic coast, mapping it in detail, at a time when human civilization was supposedly limited to small farming villages in the Fertile Crescent. Think about what that requires. Global maritime capability, navigation technology, the astronomical knowledge to calculate latitude and longitude, a culture wealthy and organized enough to fund exploration, and most critically, a reason to map the entire world. You don't chart a planet unless you're moving across it, trading across it, governing across it. How much knowledge was lost in the fires that consumed the Library of Alexandria? How many times was that library rebuilt, only to be burned again? What if those archives contained maps, astronomical tables, and technical manuals from a civilization that predated everything we know? Piri Reis said his sources were ancient. What if he was telling the truth? The Antikythera mechanism proves they had the engineering. The Baghdad Battery proves they had the science. And now the Piri Reis map proves they had the reach. This isn't about isolated anomalies anymore. This isn't about lost devices. This is about a lost world. A world that sailed, calculated, and mapped the Earth thousands of years before we thought it was possible. And then it vanished, leaving behind only fragments, ghosts, and maps that show coastlines no one should have seen. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey. Local farmers had known for generations that something was buried there. The hill was covered with limestone fragments, and whenever they ploughed the fields, their tools would strike stone slabs just beneath the surface. Schmidt began excavating, expecting to find Byzantine ruins, maybe a medieval monastery. What he found instead was impossible. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall, arranged in perfect circles. The pillars weren't crude monoliths. They were carved with intricate reliefs of animals, Serpents coiling around the stone, foxes leaping, lions prowling, vultures with outstretched wings. The artistry was breathtaking. The engineering was inexplicable. And when Schmidt sent samples for radiocarbon dating, the results came back with a date that shattered every assumption about the origins of civilization. 9,500 BC. 11,500 years ago. This was the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. Humans at this time were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following animal migrations, eating whatever they could forage. They didn't have agriculture, they didn't have settled villages, they didn't have metal tools. They weren't supposed to be capable of quarrying 20-ton limestone blocks, carving them with precision, transporting them across rough terrain, and erecting them into circular temples. Yet here it was. Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. The conventional narrative of civilization has always followed a simple sequence. First, humans domesticate plants and animals. Agriculture creates food surplus. Surplus allows specialization. Specialization leads to priests, craftsmen, and architects. And only then, once you have a complex society, do you build monuments. Göbekli Tepe inverts that entire sequence. Monuments came first. Religion came first. The need to gather, to worship, to build something sacred drove these people to organize on a scale that shouldn't have been possible. It suggests that civilization didn't arise from economics. It arose from belief. The pillars are aligned with astronomical precision. The site's main enclosures point toward the constellation Cygnus, the swan, which in ancient symbolism was often depicted as a vulture. This wasn't arbitrary. These people were tracking the stars. They were encoding celestial knowledge into stone. But why? Why would hunter-gatherers, struggling to survive, invest so much energy into building a temple? And then there's the burial. Around 8,000 BC, 1,500 years after Göbekli Tepe was built, someone deliberately buried the entire complex. They hauled tons of fill, dirt and rubble, covered every pillar, every enclosure, and sealed it beneath the earth. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't abandonment. This was intentional. This was ritual closure. But why bury something so sacred? Why hide it? One theory. It was a sacred ending, a way of closing a chapter. But another, more disturbing theory suggests they were hiding it, preserving it, protecting knowledge in a world where resources had suddenly become scarce. Because the timing of Göbekli Tepe's construction aligns almost perfectly with one of the most catastrophic events in human prehistory. Look at Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone. It shows a vulture, a scorpion, and a series of abstract symbols that researchers have interpreted as an astronomical event. Some believe it depicts a comet impact, and the date encoded in the stellar alignments, approximately 10,800 BC. That's the exact boundary of the Younger Dryas, a period when Earth was suddenly plunged back into Ice Age conditions after a brief warming. It's the moment when megafauna went extinct, when human populations crashed, when the archaeological record shows a massive discontinuity. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't the birth of civilization? What if it's a memorial? What if the people who built it were refugees from an advanced culture that had just been destroyed? They used their last resources, their remaining knowledge of astronomy and engineering, to carve a warning into stone. They built a temple not to celebrate what they had achieved, but to preserve what they were about to lose. And then, when the world became too harsh, when survival took precedence over memory, they buried it. They hid the knowledge, hoping someone in the future would dig it up and understand. What were they trying to warn us about? What did they see in the sky that made them carve vultures and comets into 20-ton pillars? And why does it feel like we're standing at the same edge they stood at 11,000 years ago, staring up at the same stars, waiting for the same fire to fall? In 10,800 BC, something happened that shouldn't be possible. The Earth, which had been warming steadily for thousands of years as the last ice age retreated, suddenly plunged back into deep freeze. Temperatures dropped. Glaciers that had been melting began advancing again. The brief window of warmth and abundance that humans and animals had been enjoying slammed shut, and it stayed closed for 1,300 years. Geologists call this period the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, that suddenly reappears in the fossil record across Europe. It's a flower that only grows in freezing tundra conditions. Its return meant the ice had come back. For decades, the orthodox explanation was gradual and boring. Melting ice sheets disrupted ocean currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, which caused regional cooling that cascaded into global climate shift. It was neat. It was slow. It fit the uniformitarian model that geologists prefer, the idea that Earth changes gradually, predictably, without catastrophe. Except the evidence kept contradicting that story. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone, Alan West, and James Kennett proposed something far more terrifying. The Younger Dryas wasn't caused by melting ice. It was caused by an impact. A comet, or more accurately, a swarm of comet fragments, struck the northern hemisphere with enough force to end the world. The evidence is written in the ground. At the 10,800 BC boundary layer, in soil samples taken from dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, scientists found nanodiamonds. These are microscopic carbon structures that only form under extreme pressure and heat, the kind generated by hypervelocity impacts or massive explosions. They also found iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets, concentrated in a thin layer across the globe. There were platinum spikes, similar to the signature left by the Chicxulub asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Carbon spherules, tiny glass beads created when rock is vaporized and recondenses in midair. Melt glass, a substance that looks like nuclear trinitite, requiring temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius to form. And then in 2018, researchers found the smoking gun. Buried under a kilometer of Greenland ice, they discovered the Hiawatha crater, 31 kilometers wide, dating to approximately 13,000 years ago. This wasn't a theoretical impact. This was a hole in the planet. Imagine the scenario. A fragmented comet, already broken into multiple pieces, enters Earth's atmosphere, traveling at tens of kilometers per second. The largest fragment strikes the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America. The impact instantly vaporizes billions of tons of ice. The shockwave flattens forests for hundreds of kilometers. The vaporized water becomes a global deluge, the flood recorded in every ancient mythology from Noah to Gilgamesh to Matsya to Deucalion. The debris cloud blocks the sun. Temperatures plummet. The world enters nuclear winter. And the megafauna, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, all the massive animals that had survived the entire ice age, die off within decades. But here's the part that should terrify you. If there were coastal civilizations in 10,800 BC, cities built along shorelines during the warm period, they would have been obliterated. First by the tsunamis generated by the impact, then by rising sea levels as the ice melted, and finally, erased by 13 centuries of cold that forced survivors inland, scattered them into small bands, and ensured that whatever knowledge they carried would degrade with each generation until it became myth. The Clovis culture in North America vanishes at this exact boundary. Their distinctive stone tools, found across the continent, abruptly stop appearing in the archaeological record. Settlements across the northern hemisphere show abandonment. Population genetic studies reveal a bottleneck, a sudden crash in human numbers around 12,000 years ago. The survivors didn't write anything down because they were too busy trying not to freeze or starve. But they remembered. Every culture on Earth has a flood myth. Every culture remembers fire from the sky, water swallowing the land, and a handful of survivors rebuilding from nothing. Graham Hancock argues in Magicians of the Gods that these survivors became the wandering shamans, the culture bearers who moved among scattered tribes, teaching agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. They built monuments like Göbekli Tepe, not as temples but as warnings. They encoded astronomical knowledge into the pyramids, Stonehenge, and structures around the world, trying to tell future generations, this happens. The sky falls. Prepare. The terrifying math is simple. The Younger Dryas impact occurred 12,800 years ago. We're currently 11,800 years past the last event. Cosmic impacts of this scale appear to follow a roughly 12 to 13,000 year cycle tied to Earth's passage through debris fields left by ancient comets. NASA tracks near-Earth objects, but comet swarms are unpredictable, often invisible until they're already too close. We're not afraid of something that might happen. We're remembering something that always happens, and it's overdue. Look at what we've assembled. The Antikythera mechanism proves the ancient world possessed mechanical engineering sophistication equal to medieval clockmakers. The Baghdad Battery proves they understood electrochemical reactions and could generate electrical current. The Piri race map proves a maritime civilization with advanced cartography existed long before the official discovery of Antarctica. Göbekli Tepe proves that so-called primitive hunter-gatherers could organize labor, quarry megalithic stones, and encode astronomical knowledge into monuments. And the Younger Dryas impact proves there was a catastrophic reset event that could have erased everything. These aren't isolated curiosities, they're fingerprints. And when you dust the entire archaeological record for prints, a pattern emerges that rewrites human history. Here's the timeline that the evidence suggests. Before 10,800 BC, during the warming period at the end of the last ice age, an advanced global civilization flourished. They had seafaring capability, astronomical knowledge, engineering prowess. They mapped coastlines that are now underwater. They built structures we can still see, but can't explain. Then the sky fell. The Younger Dryas impact destroyed coastal cities, triggered global flooding, and killed 90% of large mammals. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, used their remaining resources to build warning monuments. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was a memorial. Between 10,800 and 9,500 BC, refugees carved their cosmological knowledge into stone, hoping future generations would understand. From 9,500 to 3,000 BC, that knowledge was gradually preserved by priesthoods in Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley. It became esoteric, sacred, hidden in temples and mystery schools. By 250 to 100 BC, remnant technologies like the Baghdad Battery and Antikythera mechanism were still in use, but the understanding was fading. People could replicate the devices, but they no longer knew why they worked. And by 500 AD, after the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the collapse of Rome, and the onset of the Dark Ages, the final threads were severed. The knowledge was gone. But there are other fingerprints. The precision megalithic masonry at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Baalbek in Lebanon, Pumapunku in Bolivia. These are stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, cut with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, fitted together so tightly you can't slide a razor blade between them. Medieval stonemasons couldn't do this. Renaissance engineers couldn't do this. We struggle to do this with modern diamond-tipped saws and laser levels. The astronomical alignments are everywhere. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point to Orion, but not Orion as it appeared in 2500 BC when the pyramid was supposedly built. They point to Orion's position in 10,500 BC. The Sphinx shows water erosion patterns that, according to geologist Robert Schoch, could only have been caused by heavy rainfall over centuries. But the Giza Plateau hasn't seen that kind of rain since 7,000 to 5,000 BC, during a wetter climate period thousands of years before the pharaohs. Even our DNA tells the story. Genetic studies show a population bottleneck around 12,000 years ago. Human numbers crashed. We nearly went extinct. The survivors carried forward fragments of knowledge through oral tradition, through priesthoods, through secret societies that understood more than they ever wrote down. Plato's story of Atlantis, dismissed as allegory, might have been inherited history passed down from Egyptian priests, who themselves had inherited it from an even older source. Atlantis wasn't fiction. It was the world before the flood. Why did we forget? Most of the evidence is underwater. Sea levels rose 400 feet after the impact as the ice melted. Every coastal city, every harbour, every centre of trade and knowledge drowned. The survivors weren't thinking about preserving libraries. They were thinking about finding food and shelter. Writing may not have been invented yet, or if it was lost. Oral knowledge degrades over generations, becoming myth, legend, and eventually dismissed as fantasy. And academic gatekeeping has suppressed catastrophism for over a century, preferring the comfortable gradualism of uniformitarianism. To suggest a comet reset civilization invites ridicule, but here's the modern parallel that should keep you awake. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, what would survive 10,000 years? The internet would be gone instantly. Books would rot. Metal would rust. Concrete would crumble. What would remain? Stone monuments, the pyramids, Mount Rushmore, and myths, fragmented stories about the time before, when humans flew through the air and spoke across oceans and carried the sum of all knowledge in devices they held in their hands. Future archaeologists would dig up our ruins and call us primitive. They'd find a smartphone, corroded and inert, and argue it was decorative. They'd say we couldn't possibly have had advanced technology because there's no evolutionary development, no texts describing it. And they'd be wrong. Just like we are. Knowledge is more fragile than we admit. It requires continuous transmission, an unbroken chain of teaching from one generation to the next. Literacy isn't natural. It requires schools, teachers, standardized curricula, and most critically, stability. Technology is even more precarious. Every advanced device depends on specialized craftspeople, supply chains, raw materials, and institutional memory. If one generation fails to pass on what it knows, if the chain breaks for even a few decades, the knowledge doesn't just fade, it vanishes. History is littered with examples of catastrophic forgetting. Roman concrete, the material used to build the Pantheon, and aqueducts that still stand after 2,000 years, was superior to anything we made until the 20th century. The recipe was lost for over a millennium. We only rediscovered the secret recently. They used volcanic ash and seawater to create a self-healing chemical reaction. Greek fire, the Byzantine superweapon that burned on water and couldn't be extinguished, terrified enemies for centuries. The formula was so closely guarded that when the Byzantine Empire fell, it was lost forever. We still don't know exactly how they made it. The Maya developed the mathematical concept of zero independently, a profound intellectual achievement. After the Spanish conquest, when the priests were killed and the codices burned, that knowledge was forgotten for centuries. Damascus steel, the legendary metal used to forge swords that could cut through European blades, was lost in the 18th century when the supply of a specific ore ran out. Modern metallurgists still can't perfectly replicate it. And these are examples from civilizations that had writing, that left records, that tried to preserve their knowledge. Imagine what happens in a true collapse, when survivors are scattered, when there are no books, no institutions, no teachers. After the Younger Dryas impact, the remnants of whatever civilization existed were reduced to small, nomadic bands, struggling to survive 13 centuries of cold. Oral tradition is all they had, and oral tradition degrades. A precise technical process becomes a simplified ritual. We came from the sea, and brought knowledge becomes the fish god taught us agriculture. Precision gearing calculates celestial positions, becomes wheels are sacred because they mirror the sacred concision, heavens. The practical becomes symbolic, the symbolic becomes mythological, and eventually, myth is dismissed as fantasy. Memory becomes legend, legend becomes fairy tale, and the truth is forgotten entirely. But the trauma remains. Encoded in our DNA, in our collective unconscious, is the memory of near extinction. Every culture on Earth has flood myths. Not some cultures. All cultures. The Greeks had Deucalion, the Mesopotamians had Gilgamesh and the flood of Utnapishtim, the Hebrews had Noah, the Hindus had Matsya. Indigenous Australians, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, all remember water swallowing the world. They remember fire from the sky. The Greeks told of Phaethon, the sun chariot that fell and scorched the earth. Hindu texts describe flying weapons that burned like 1,000 suns. Aboriginal Australians speak of stars falling. These aren't fantasies. They're ancestral memories of the day the sky fell and the world drowned. Every ancient culture also remembers a lost golden age. Hesiod wrote of the age of gold when humans lived like gods before decline set in. The Vedic texts describe the Satya Yuga, a perfect era before corruption. The Aztecs believed in previous worlds, each destroyed in cataclysm. Plato spoke of Atlantis, These aren't myths. They're history, passed down orally for so many generations that the details blurred, but the core truth remained. We were greater once, and we fell. So here's the uncomfortable question. Are we preserving our knowledge any better than they did? We've digitized everything. The entire sum of human knowledge fits on servers and hard drives. But what happens if an electromagnetic pulse from a solar flare wipes out the electrical grid? What happens if a catastrophe disrupts the infrastructure that keeps those servers running? Digital storage degrades. Hard drives fail. Magnetic tape deteriorates. The ancients carved warnings into stone that lasted 12,000 years. Our data might not survive 12. The irony is almost unbearable. We've built a civilization more dependent on fragile technology than any that came before. And we're walking the same path they did, confident in our permanence, blind to our fragility, convinced that collapse can't happen to us. They thought the same thing. And then the sky fell. Twice a year, Earth passes through a debris field left by a massive comet that broke apart roughly 20,000 years ago. We call it the Taurid meteor stream. And we pass through it in late June and early July, and again in October and November. Most of the fragments are small, harmless, burning up as shooting stars, but some are larger. And every few decades or centuries, one of those larger fragments gets close enough to remind us how fragile our existence really is. In 1908, something from the Taurid stream exploded over the Tunguska region of Siberia with a force of 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Trees were snapped like matchsticks, laid out in a radial pattern from the blast center. If that explosion had occurred over a city instead of empty wilderness, millions would have died. In 2013, another Taurid fragment entered the atmosphere over Chelyabinsk, Russia. It was only 17 meters across, but the shockwave shattered windows across the city and injured 1,500 people. These aren't hypothetical threats. This is cosmic roulette, and we're still at the table. The pattern is undeniable. Large-scale impact events occur roughly every 12 to 13,000 years, a cycle that corresponds with Earth's passage through the densest part of the Taurid stream and coincides with the transitions between glacial and interglacial periods. The Younger Dryas impact happened 12,800 years ago. We are currently 11,800 years past that event. Statistically, we're overdue. NASA tracks near-Earth objects, cataloguing asteroids and comets that might pose a threat. But the catalogue is incomplete. We've identified perhaps 90% of the kilometer-sized objects, the ones large enough to cause extinction-level events. But comets are different. They come from the outer solar system, often appearing with little warning, streaking toward us out of the dark. By the time we see them, there may not be time to react. And if a comet is already fragmented, if it's a loose swarm of debris like the Taurids, tracking every piece becomes impossible. Graham Hancock has proposed that ancient monuments encode the date of the next cataclysm, that the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, and Stonehenge were trying to warn us. The precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year astronomical cycle caused by the wobble of Earth's axis, appears encoded in structures around the world. The halfway point of that cycle, roughly 12,960 years, shows up again and again in ancient calendars and mythologies. It's as if they were saying, this is when it happens. This is when the sky falls. Pay attention. But we don't. We suffer from normalcy bias, the psychological tendency to assume that because things have been stable in our lifetime, they will remain stable. We've experienced relatively calm weather, predictable seasons, and no major cosmic impacts, so we assume that's the default state of the planet. It isn't. Our entire recorded history, all 5,000 years of writing and cities and empires, has occurred during an unusually stable climatic period. We've been living in a brief window of calm between cataclysms. The ancients tried to warn us through myths and monuments. It happens. Prepare. But we've dismissed their warnings as superstition. And here's the terrifying part. We're more fragile now than the survivors of the Younger Dryas ever were. They lived in small bands, knew how to hunt, forage, make fire, build shelter. If the infrastructure collapsed, they could survive. We can't. Modern civilization depends on electrical grids, global supply chains, just-in-time food delivery systems. Most cities have less than 3 days of food on hand at any given time. If one major impact event disrupts the grid, if the satellites go dark and the trucks stop running, 90% of the population dies within months. Not from the impact itself, but from starvation, disease, and chaos. The knowledge loss would be catastrophic. The survivors wouldn't have time to preserve Wikipedia or digitize libraries. They'd be scavenging for canned food and clean water. And 12,000 years later, archaeologists in the year 22,000 AD would dig up our cities, find corroded smartphones, and argue over whether we could have possibly understood microchips. They'd dismiss it as impossible. They'd say we were primitive. And the cycle would repeat. Again. The ancients understood something we've forgotten. If you want knowledge to survive apocalypse, you carve it in stone. The pyramids aren't just tombs. They encode astronomical data, mathematical constants, the precise length of the solar year. Göbekli Tepe isn't just a temple. It's a star map, a warning carved into 20-ton pillars. Easter Island's moai aren't just statues. They mark astronomical alignments and encode navigation knowledge. These structures were built to outlast empires, languages, and catastrophes. They were archives designed for deep time. The survivors of the Younger Dryas also understood this. They preserved knowledge through mystery schools, secret societies that passed down cosmological wisdom through oral tradition and ritual. The Egyptian priesthoods, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean schools, all claimed to possess ancient knowledge inherited from before the flood. They taught astronomy, geometry, agriculture, the technical skills needed to rebuild civilization. When they spoke of gods descending to teach humanity, they may have been describing culture bearers, the last engineers and astronomers from the lost world, wandering among scattered tribes, trying to preserve what could be saved. We're finally starting to grasp the same imperative. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in the permafrost of Norway, stores samples of crop diversity from around the world. If industrial agriculture collapses, if climate shifts, or disease wipes out modern monocultures, the genetic material to restart farming is preserved in that frozen ark. The Arctic World Archive stores data on specialized film designed to last 1,000 years, tucked into an abandoned coal mine in Svalbard. The Longnau Foundation is building a 10,000-year clock inside a mountain in Texas, a monument designed to shift human thinking toward deep time, to make us consider what our actions mean across millennia. The Arch Mission Foundation is backing up human knowledge on the Moon and Mars, literally off-planet archives in case Earth becomes uninhabitable. There was another attempt, one that's already been destroyed. The Georgia Guidestones, erected in 1980 and demolished in 2022, were a granite monument inscribed with messages in 8 languages about rebuilding civilization after catastrophe. The instructions were simple: maintain population balance with nature, guide reproduction wisely, preserve diversity, rule with reason. Whether you agreed with the messages or not, the intent was clear. Someone was trying to create a post-apocalyptic instruction manual, carved in stone, designed to endure. The challenge is almost impossible. How do you create a warning that remains comprehensible for 10,000 years? Languages change. Symbols lose meaning. The same problem haunts nuclear waste disposal. We're burying radioactive material that will remain deadly for hundreds of thousands of years, and we have no idea how to mark the sites in a way that future humans will understand. We've proposed pictograms, landscapes of thorns, monuments radiating menace. But would people 10,000 years from now recognize the danger? Or would they dig, curious about what the ancients buried, and poison themselves? The irony is almost absurd. The ancients solved this problem with myth and megalith. They encoded warnings in stories that transcended language, in monuments aligned with stars that speak a universal language. And we, with all our technology, struggle with the same challenge. We're rediscovering what they already knew. Stone lasts, stories endure, and the sky never lies. There's a recursive pattern here. Each civilization must independently rediscover that collapse is possible. Each generation assumes it's immune, that progress is inevitable, that the past was primitive and the future is secure. And each time, reality proves otherwise. But there's hope. If we recognize the cycle, if we accept that catastrophe is not a matter of if, but when, we might break the pattern. Space colonization means humanity isn't confined to one planet. Impact deflection technology means we might be able to push dangerous asteroids off course. Knowledge preservation means the next survivors won't have to start from zero. But we have to overcome the hubris. We assume our science makes us immune, that we've transcended the forces that destroyed previous civilizations. They thought the same thing. They built machines that calculated the stars. They generated electricity. They mapped the world. And then the sky fell, and it all turned to dust. We're standing at the same precipice they stood at, staring into the same abyss, convinced that this time, somehow, we're different. We're not. The only difference is whether we'll listen to the warnings they carved in stone 12,000 years ago, or whether we'll ignore them and become the next layer of amnesia buried beneath the ground, waiting for the archaeologists of the future to dig us up and wonder what we forgot. Look back at what we've assembled. The Antikythera mechanism proves we've lost technology before. Advanced mechanical engineering, computational astronomy, precision gearing, all vanished for 14 centuries as if it never existed. The Baghdad Battery proves we've lost science before. Electrochemical knowledge, the ability to generate and harness electrical current, forgotten for 2,000 years. The Piri Reis map proves we've lost global civilization before. Maritime empires that charted coastlines now buried under ice, erased so completely we didn't believe they existed until we found the maps. Göbekli Tepe proves we've built monuments to remember before. Temples carved by survivors, trying to preserve cosmological knowledge after their world ended. And the Younger Dryas impact proves we've died before. We've faced extinction, watched the sky fall, and crawled out of the ashes with nothing but fragmented memories and the will to survive. The central revelation is inescapable. Human history is not a line ascending toward inevitable progress. It's a spiral. We rise, we fall, we forget, we rise again. Each iteration believes it's the first, the pinnacle, the exception. Each iteration is wrong. The philosophical shift this demands is total. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We're one iteration in a cycle that stretches back further than we dare imagine. Progress is not inevitable, collapse is cyclical, and the ancients weren't primitive. They were survivors. Refugees from worlds that burned, trying desperately to pass forward what little they could save. Our compulsion to build, to explore, to preserve, to encode knowledge into monuments and myths. It's not ambition. It's trauma. It's evolutionary memory of near extinction. The genetic echo of ancestors who watched everything they knew turn to ash and swore that if they survived, they would leave something behind, some proof that they existed, some warning for whoever came after. We build because we remember dying, even if we don't consciously know it anymore. The question that haunts is simple and terrible. How many times has this happened? How many cycles have there been? If 90% of the evidence is underwater, submerged by rising seas after each cataclysm, and we've only explored 5% of the ocean floor, what else is down there? What cities, what temples, what libraries are buried beneath miles of silt and salt water, waiting for submersibles that might never find them? The archaeological invisibility of a drowned world means we could be the 10th iteration, the 100th, and we'd never know. Every civilization thinks it's immortal. Every empire believes it will last forever. Rome thought so. Egypt thought so. The Maya thought so. All of them are ruins now. Their language is dead. Their knowledge scattered. We think we're different because we have computers and satellites and nuclear weapons. They had their own miracles. Bronze gears that calculated eclipses, batteries that generated lightning, maps that showed the world entire. And it didn't save them. The artifacts we've examined aren't museum curiosities. They're messages in bottles from the last survivors of the previous world. They're warnings, carved in stone and cast in bronze, encoded in maps and myths, screaming across 12,000 years. It happens. You are not safe. Prepare. And we have a choice. We can heed that warning. We can recognize the cycle, preserve our knowledge, colonize other worlds, deflect the next impact, and maybe, just maybe, break the pattern. Or we can dismiss it, the way every previous civilization dismissed the warnings of their ancestors, and become the next layer of compressed amnesia buried in the ground. The ground beneath your feet isn't soil. It's the pulverized remains of cities, the dust of technologies we no longer recognize, the graveyard of languages no one speaks. It's compressed forgetting. And somewhere, 12,000 years from now, another species, or another iteration of humanity, will dig up our skyscrapers and iPhones and wonder how we built microchips, how we split atoms, how we forgot. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, we're approaching the final verse. The monuments are waiting. The evidence is screaming. The Tarid stream is still there, circling the sun, waiting for Earth to pass through its densest debris. The only question left is, are we listening? Or are we just the latest chapter in humanity's eternal book of forgetting, destined to write the same tragedy again, in slightly different words, until the spiral finally breaks? Tell me in the comments, do you believe we're the first? Or are we just one more turn of the wheel, spinning toward the same inevitable edge our ancestors fell from? The choice is ours. For now,